Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for attending this webinar on life science R&D in space. So it's quite an exciting topic. Can you hear me well? If someone can confirm in the chat. Yes, perfect, seems to work. Awesome. So my name is Lucy Campagnolo. I'm project manager at Modèles, which is the Institute for Space Medicine and Physiology. And I'm also in charge of healthcare activity at Connect by CNES. It's the innovation initiative of the French Space Agency. And today we are going to speak about quite an exciting topic, and how to bridge life science and space activity. To speak today around me, we have Chloe Evans. Chloe is the head of market research and international relations at France Biotech, which is the largest professional association in French about life science. And she will represent everything related to this area. For the space side, we thank very much Hilde Steenwit from the Belgian company Space Application Services, and in particular IceCube. And she will explain how, or from the space point of view, do we have assets for life science activity. And in between, we are very happy to have Cynthia Butto. She is the president of Space Commerce Matters. It's quite an innovative company dedicated to the commercialization of low Earth orbit. So what does that mean? She will explain everything during this webinar. And last but not least, we have Kenneth Savin. He's a former principal scientist of Eli Lilly in the United States. Thank you very much, Ken, for attending this webinar in Europe. We may have lots of people waiting for your testimony, because we really want to know how is it to do science in space when you come from another type of company. So please, next slide, Jonathan. Today, we will try to be brief and to the point. We have 90 minutes together. We will start with a short overview of why are we doing that, why are we here today. I will be your host, and with me, Chloe Evans. And then Cynthia Butto and her team is going to present exactly what could be the assets or the interest of microgravity for life science activity. So we will try to really be focused on this area, but do not hesitate to ask questions in the question and answer features that is in this Hopin platform. You can ask your question in English or in French. We will be able to translate it, or in other language, but it may be a little bit difficult. And then we will have a panel discussion with all our speakers to really ask practical questions. 20 minutes will remain for your questions. Do not hesitate to ask everything in the chat, and we will have them speak to the speaker and hope get some answer that will answer all your clarifications. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. It's time to get started. So when we speak about space, usually people speak about astronauts or Earth observation or satellite data, rockets, the International Space Station sometimes, and it's always look like something complex, far away from like your daily activities. There is a part of dream also associated with the space industry. And it's quite trending right now. You may have seen lots of media coverage recently, lots of initiative of constellation, private tourists, astronauts, billionaire astronauts, they want to go to space. But this is not exactly what we are going to discuss today. Next slide. So today we are going to start from the other part of the story about the life science application, and to focus on what are the current needs on the terrestrial market. So sorry, we have to speak about terrestrial market and space market. It's a little bit weird, but basically in your market, what are the current challenges? And is there any technical problems or bottlenecks that can be solved with the unique features of the space environment, and in particular microgravity? So we will cover topics such as the medtech industry, biotech industry, pharmaceutical and drug manufacturing industry. but also everything related to the digital health, epidemiology, and telemedicine. Next slide, please. So I'm going to explain very briefly how do we do usually research in space. So this is a picture taken to the International Space Station, which is this big spacecraft that orbit around the Earth. It's not far away. It's 400 kilometers above our head. So we call it the low Earth orbit. And inside you have a crew of astronauts. Usually it's between 6 or 9 people that are here to do maintenance, but also to perform science. And whenever a group of scientists would like to have science done in space, they apply usually to their National Space Agency or to the European Space Agency. And they're selected on if the science is excellent, they get implemented, and we have like a whole machinery in order to get results. It's really focused on scientific publication, scientific excellence, and it's one way to do it in space. Next slide, please. But recently, you may have seen that space is changing. There is lots and lots of private initiative, things that were not possible before, such as people like you and me going to space as kind of tourists. It's now a reality. It's very soon. And there is lots of infrastructure that are now dedicated to different kind of use cases. For example, what we call private or industrial project. It's basically one company, one consortium of companies. They want to do science for their own benefit, to be redirected on their terrestrial strategic innovation scheme. And for that, they sometimes don't want to go through the agency because it's not exactly the same purpose. They want to have a fast access and use space as a services. And this is really something new. In our colleague from the United States has been quite a few years already. But what about Europe? Next slide, please. So in Europe, this is also possible. And Hilde Steenwijk, she represents all this commercial space service provider in Europe. It exists, but there is a lack of awareness of all this possibility. And for that, we have been selected by the European Space Agency, ESA, at the bottom of this schematic, because they want us to go to you, to the life science industry, and explain what could be the benefit to go to space for your research. And they are ready to co-found some of this initiative in order to support the European competitiveness. So what you have to imagine is that we can offer some access to the International Space Station based on your need and what's your goal. And this is a unique environment that cannot be found on Earth. And this will allow you to perform either some planned or disruptive innovation. And the purpose of this initiative is then to retransfer the benefit of what has been done in space on Earth. So this is a very important part. There is a space, an economic market on Earth, but on the space, it's more topics that are dedicated to space exploration, for example, to go on Moon or Mars. And it is a complete different constraint and story. Next slide, please. For me, the slide has not changed. I don't know if you see something else on your screen.
No one says Medis on it.
Never mind, I can improvise. Yes, Modèles is on. It has worked. Okay, so I'm working for Modèles. What is Modèles? Modèles is the Institute for Space Medicine and Physiology. We are located in France, but we work in whole Europe. It's a hybrid organization between space and health, and our main member are CNES, the French Space Agency, and Toulouse Hospital. And we have a very precise proposition value. We work to provide expertise and operational support in the field of space medicine. quite a niche activity. We also work, we operate a clinical research facility, and we try to really promote space innovation and healthcare innovation at the same time. Next slide, please. Okay, it hasn't changed, but I know, I think I know what is on the next slide. So at MEDES, we have 3 teams and 3 expertise. One is the operational support in the International Space Station. Our engineer and physicians, they sit on console and they support astronauts while they are doing research in space. So if they have any questions, if something is not really clear, they cannot be specialists of all the kind of scientific experiments that they are asked to perform. Our second team operates clinical research, and what we do is that we put people lying down for a certain amount of time, and this mimics the effect of microgravity on the body. And finally, we have the innovation team, and we really try to support innovation projects and to make the bridge between all this community. They don't really speak the same language, they don't have the same goals, so it's quite an interesting job. Next slide, please. So you should be seeing Connect by CNES? No? On my side, it's still MEDES.
Yeah, Connect by CNES, Lucy.
Okay. So Connect by CNES, it's the part of CNES that is really dedicated to develop a new community of users for space data, space activities, space assets, space knowledge. The idea is really that everything that has been developed for space application benefits the economic, societal, and environmental development in France and in Europe. And at MEDES, we operate the CNES, the healthcare part of this program, and this series of webinars is part of this program. Next slide. And what do we do at Connect by CNES? We try to have a service offer that help all the project provider from the incubation of the startup, if it's a startup, for the incubation of the idea or project, if it's a consortium. Then we provide some expertise, some space patents. We have dedicated teams that are here to work with you hands-on on your project. We try to redirect you to appropriate funding. For example, we operate the BAS, so Business Application Services, from ESA. We provide some free training for everybody that could be curious about space. And finally, we do lots of promotional activity, including this webinar. Next slide, please. So I will let the floor to our partner for today, Chloé Evans and France Biotech.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I'm delighted to be here to represent France Biotech and to talk about this exciting topic. So just to start with, just a few words about France Biotech. So next slide, please. Next one again. Okay, perfect. So France Biotech, so we are the National French Association of Health Tech and Biotech companies. So we represent innovative companies which are involved in medical research, and particularly biotech companies and medical devices. So we are a network of over 400 members. We founded 20 years ago, a little bit more than 20 years ago. And our main mission is really to try and create the right environment for companies to thrive and to develop, both on the national markets, but also internationally, as we know that biotech companies and medical devices companies are international quite early on in their development. So we have 3 main actions. Our first mission is really to be a network community. So we organize events, webinars, including this one, to talk about specific programs, specific projects. We also like to inform our members of different initiatives and to offer some content, business development contacts. We organize those kind of events to connect both our members which are active in research and also our partner members, which are consulting firms or pharmaceutical companies and which are quite natural partners for these innovative SMEs. Our second activity is a think tank activity, which is based on 9 different committees and 3 working groups on different topics such as corporate finance, advanced therapeutic medicinal products, ATMPs, and biomanufacturing. For example, we have a committee which is dedicated to that. And the idea of these committees is really to try and make recommendations and to help members with information. So they publish a lot of reports on different topics, and also to help us with our proposals and propositions to governments, which really brings us to our third mission, which is to be one of the main points of contacts for health institutions and ministries and which part of the government, the French government. So we have regular contacts with those ministries and decision makers, and our role is really to inform them on particular topics, issues, and to make some propositions. And we act both at a national level, but also at an international level, particularly at the European level, where we have very strong ties with associations such as EuropaBio and UCUP, which represent European companies, biotech companies. And also we're part of the International Council of Biotechnology Associations, along with Bio and Bio-Deutschland, and basically all the different national associations for each country active in healthcare. So that's really our mission: network, think tank, and lobbying. And so really delighted to be a partner of this session today. We try and bring information to our members and trying to create partnerships and opportunities to partner with different actors. And this topic is particularly exciting and will be very interesting and very exciting to see what kind of applications which can be done in R&D in space. So yeah, delighted to be here. And
thank you very much, Chloe. It's a pleasure to have you and France Biotech on board. Next slide, please, Jonathan. Okay, what are we talking about since 15 minutes? That's a great question. To answer this question, we welcome Cynthia Bouteau, the president of Space Commerce Matters. It's an innovation company focused on commercialization of low Earth orbit, and her team. Thank you very much for being here. Prior to starting her own company, Cynthia was at the ISS National Lab in the US, and she developed model to generate non-traditional space demand. What is it, Cynthia? Can you please explain us and to the audience, what are you doing?
Sure. Thank you, Lucy, and thanks to you and Chloe. It's great to be here as well. Next slide, Jonathan. So really, and I think Lucy did a great job at the beginning, positioning this new opportunity in space, specifically in low Earth orbit. And what we're talking about really is the ability to do new science and innovation, higher quality research and development, and manufactured products. We're also seeing new commercial opportunity. And today what we're going to do is explain a little bit about the science. Why do you get higher quality R&D products or manufactured products? And what is some of this commercial opportunity and commercial return? And then ultimately, there is the ability to do marketing and branding. Next slide, please. When we talk about this, and again, I loved Lucy's slides at the beginning, we hear a lot about space these days. And what we're really hearing about from the space agencies and some of the bigger companies involved in space is the exploration agenda. The moon, Mars, and beyond. And we're hearing about this in the news pretty much every day. But there's this other piece, which is called low Earth orbit, or shortened to LEO, which is that band right around the Earth. It's about 1,000 kilometers up. It's where the majority of our satellites operate, and it's where the International Space Station orbits. And that's the environment we're talking about today that creates new opportunity for you to do things up there and bring back for use for your own terrestrial purposes. Next slide, please. And again, this is, really based on what Lucy said. We are hearing so much with this traditional focus on the supply side. You hear about SpaceX and ESA Space Rider and the new commercial astronauts that are going on. But if you go to the next slide, Jonathan, what about demand? Why do we not necessarily hear as much about this? And I think the reason is there's just this lack of awareness of what really those opportunities are in low Earth orbit and what has already happened. So we're already seeing organizations create better novel materials and sustainability programs. We're looking at drug development and delivery systems, accelerated disease models, looking at tissue engineering and organ development. And that's what we're really going to talk about today. What are those opportunities for you and your organizations to do those types of activities up on the International Space Station with the help of Lucy and the programs that she's talking about to benefit your organization back here? Next slide, please. When we talk about space, we talk about the fact that it's almost like it's a new market. And when you go into a new market, what are you looking for? You're looking for economic return, innovation or science return, and also humankind and social impacts. And these are the categories that we're actually measuring today and showing tangible benefit in new revenue creation or accelerated time to market or quality of life improvements or new innovation pathways. So ultimately, this idea that space is out there and it's this intangible activity, we're really changing that paradigm, and we're showing that you can achieve these types of benefits by doing activity in low Earth orbit. Next slide, please. And these are just some of the examples and some of the organizations and companies that have already done this type of activity in life science and crop science, in consumer products and industrial work, in technologies and communications, and in some of these sustainability areas. And as Lucy mentioned, we're really lucky to have Ken Saban, formerly with Eli Lilly and now with the ISS National Lab, to talk about some of the project work that they did as a non-traditional space company. Next slide, please. These are the some of the broad areas that we will be covering today and that are really relevant to doing something in space. So on the research side, we mentioned the disease modeling, the cell biology, the genomics, chemistry, fluid dynamics, and then really the impacts to the industry on the right-hand side are very broad. And, obviously today we're focused more on the life sciences, but there are applications in low Earth orbit that apply to all of these industries on the right-hand side. Next slide. We also wanted to talk, because a couple of slides back, most of those companies were big Fortune 500 type organizations, but we're also seeing a lot of startups. And I'm thinking on this call today, there's probably a lot of startups and entrepreneurs. And the message that we'd like to say to you is there is opportunity for startups as well. And not just to do the sort of scientific work, but what we saw on the US side is some of these startups that we worked with as part of an accelerator in Boston actually used that work on the International Space Station to generate additional funding for their startup, which obviously as a startup is one of the key goals. So what we're really thinking is doing work in low Earth orbit has lots of benefits, including for those in the startup area. Next slide, please. And then one of my favorite areas, yes, you can do work in low Earth orbit for your own commercial purpose, but there's also the ability to look at these broader problems like climate change or sustainability areas, oceans and ocean health as an example. And we're seeing coalitions come together to look at using space as the solution set to really solve those big problems on Earth. And we're seeing X Prize type open innovation competitions. And hopefully we're going to be seeing some of these in France, focused on some of these big issues. Next slide, please. All right, and now to the next slide. So, you know, why space? And Lucy mentioned the unique propositions or the unique phenomena. And when we talk about it, why would you ever do something in low Earth orbit? There are three primary phenomena that are adding to the benefits that you're seeing. The first is microgravity. And Molly and Jonathan are going to go through and actually describe for you what is it about microgravity and how it influences cell behavior or fluid physics or the various processes across the physical and life sciences. The changes are profound, and it's really the reason why you would do something in low Earth orbit in the life sciences area. And go to the next slide. The second big unique phenomena is the extreme conditions. We have external platforms on the ISS, and that will give you access to heat and cold cycling, atomic oxygen, radiation, debris impact. Ultimately, what may take decades to degrade here on Earth may take weeks or months in low Earth orbit. So it's a great test bed for accelerated degradation testing. And then the third major area, which probably we're all more familiar with, is the vantage point. How do you use remote sensing and Earth observation applications with the unique orbit that the ISS has to understand some of these downstream impacts and applications? And what I would just say is many of our projects don't just use one of these solution sets. You know, you might have a problem around plastics in the ocean, and you could use microgravity to develop a novel material, a new plastic that does not degrade the oceans, while at the same time using the vantage point to help detect the migration of those plastics in the ocean. So ultimately, we believe that the ISS and low Earth orbit provides an incredible solution set for the problems or the challenges that we're looking to solve here on Earth. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Molly, who's going to, Dr. Molly Mulligan, who's going to talk about some of the science impacts and why space.
Thank you, Cindy. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to go through some of the different applications at a really high level before we dive into some of the actual science that's been done on the ISS. The process of macromolecule or protein crystallization in space is greatly affected by microgravity. The lack of sedimentation and being in a diffusion-driven environment tends to lead to larger, more ordered structures than we can obtain on the ground. And this can help us in finding new targets for significant diseases, drug discovery, formulation and delivery, and biomarker discovery. Jonathan, if you can go to the next slide. Thanks. Cell biology is a hot topic in space. People always want to grow cells. And why is that? Well, microgravity allows cells to form 3D structures without the use of a scaffolding or matrix. Since there isn't gravity, you don't just get a flat carpet of cells on the bottom of a petri dish. Instead, they tend to grow in 3 dimensions. And this is used in everything from tissue chips to 3D cell culturing. We even have a 3D bioprinter on station looking at stem cells and regenerative medicine. Jonathan, next slide. Thank you. Microorganisms are also something people really like to study in space. The diffusion-driven environment of microgravity in space induces changes in the behavior and virulence of microorganisms. Things like bacteria, funguses, viruses, and the formation of biofilms have been studied. Next slide. We also like to use space as a way to model various diseases. Humans and the cells of humans experience changes in space due to the lack of gravity. We're all used to being on Earth and having gravity pull us down. And so we look at things like muscle and bone loss, which astronauts experience when they're in microgravity, immune dysfunction, cancer tumors, organoids, and model organisms such as rodents for rodent-based research. Next slide. We also look at the growth of plants. Microgravity can be used to probe the mechanisms to understand how plants that we grow every day on Earth respond to gravity, and it also activates stress responses in plants, which can lead to plants with better resistance to drought and better resistance to salt in the water. So plants growing in space experience stress. They have different growth patterns, whether in the root or the shoot. We can also look at plant microbe interactions, crop monitoring, and water monitoring using remote sensing. Jonathan, next slide. And I'm going to let Dr. Jonathan Volk talk about the next few slides.
Thanks, Molly. In addition to being your slide turner today, I'll be giving you a little overview of kind of the general science benefits of low Earth orbit. So the first one here is material synthesis. So the lack of gravity enables more ordered materials to be formulated. The lack of convection, buoyancy, and sedimentation on a molecular level, you can formulate a material with fewer defects. As most of you know and think that fewer defects means a better performing material. And that really applies to all types of materials. So obviously in the life science fields, you're more focused on polymers, biomaterials, but this also applies to things like ceramics, metals, semiconductors, etc. So being able to formulate a material with fewer defects, whether for R&D purposes or actual manufacturing, is a unique feature of the microgravity environment. We also look at evaluating material, looking at property measurements and behavior, so for modeling purposes, looking at being able to evaluate diffusion coefficients in a diffusion-driven environment, looking at thermal conductivity in a purely conductive environment. It really enables you to get more accurate values for models, and also looking at system behavior such as phase transitions, etc. So looking at material behavior is also very, very important. Fluid dynamics, very important in the life sciences for drug delivery, things like that. So evaluating a fluid flow in a very surface-driven environment, being able to look at how diffusion plays a role, how surface tension plays a role in a much more isolated way without those gravitational forces impacting it. You can isolate those non-gravitational forces to really study how fluids behave. So looking at how an interface behaves, that's very important in some of the pharmaceutical examples we're going to talk about. So it's a great environment to look at fluids and transport. We can also do types of reaction chemistry, looking at both flow chemistry and batch chemistry. Flow chemistry is an up-and-coming type application in the microgravity environment. Facilities are being developed to look at flow chemistry and look at the benefits of that in LEO. Also mixing, obviously without sedimentation, how do different liquids and other substances mix together? How do they bind together without gravitational interference can be very, very, very important. And also looking at combustion, diffusion-driven combustion versus convection-driven combustion. So there's been a lot of combustion experiments done on the ISS for both space and terrestrial purposes. So that's kind of all the microgravity scientific examples or scientific areas. Real quickly, Cindy already talked about this a few slides back, but looking at external environment for materials testing, looking at how materials fail much faster than you could on the ground. How do they corrode with all those different types of extreme conditions like thermal cycling, the oxidation? How do materials fail, and be able to test that much faster than on the ground is a great benefit. And then also looking at the remote sensing side of things. So all types of remote sensing can be done utilizing the vantage point of the ISS, getting those big data sets about large geographic regions, whether they're continental or global, whether you're looking at visible data, you're looking at infrared data, radar, et cetera. You can get those big data sets, and they have things about the environment, whether they're about, as Cindy mentioned, looking at ocean plastic migration patterns in the ocean, looking at overall ocean health, ocean temperatures, agricultural, monitoring natural disasters, searching for raw materials, which could be important in the life science sector. So there's a lot of great remote sensing applications and a lot of types of sensing you can do utilizing the vantage point of the ISS and LEO. So that's kind of the general overall science of LEO. Now we're going to turn it back to Molly, and she's going to give you some real good examples of flight projects that were actually conducted on the ISS and LEO related to the life science sector.
Thank you, Jonathan. If you want to go to the next slide, we're going to jump in here to examples of flight projects that have actually been done, really look at what companies are doing. So Merck is a great example. They were looking at the crystallization of their blockbuster drug Keytruda and looking for a new drug formulation. Why would a company like Merck go to space to formulate their drugs? Well, the formulation of drugs is a highly concentrated crystalline suspension and is an important way that drugs are currently created on the ground. But being able to improve the formulation, whether that's by creating a single crystal drug or being able to produce a crystal that's smaller or a different shape than what we can do on Earth, helps both in the formulation, the storage, the purification, and in the long run, the value of it is that it could be a more targeted medication with fewer side effects due to smaller doses. We could also find new ways to administer these drugs, whether that be something like an insulin pump on the arm rather than a patient having to go to a hospital setting where they're at greater risk for catching other diseases if they're receiving a cancer treatment. Using space to study the crystalline structure of drugs like Keytruda is very helpful for companies like Merck to find new formulations and new ways to deliver those drugs. Jonathan, next slide. Thank you. Synthetic biology is also something that can be done in microgravity. So the space station, as you'll see as we go through these, really has a lot of offerings in terms of what can be done. And eventually, when we go to the moon, Mars, and beyond, astronauts are going to need to make and not bring a lot of the things they'll need to sustain themselves. From food to fuel to medication, we go to space and study synthetic biology, both for uses in long duration spaceflight and exploration, but also for being able to produce valuable biomolecules for the food, fuel, medication that people need in remote areas of the US. And the real impact of this technology is not just in being able to get vital medications and nutrients to people in remote locations of Earth, as well as astronauts in long duration spaceflight, but also being able to find better biomolecules using microgravity. Next slide. AstraZeneca looked at the stability of monoclonal antibodies using microgravity. And we know that monoclonal antibodies terrestrially tend to degrade over time, and we end up throwing out a lot of them, which adds additional cost and can prevent these treatments from getting to remote parts of the world. So why did AstraZeneca go to space to look at this? Well, microgravity can help them understand the process of the degradation and the formulation stability for monoclonal antibodies. And this matters because we could find new methods of monoclonal antibody production and better formulations to improve production methods, making these methods more cost-effective and allowing access in remote parts of the world to these drugs. Next slide. All right. As I mentioned before, we see in astronauts that there's an immune deficiency. Their immune system is not as strong when they're exposed to microgravity. And ESO is looking at these changes in the immune system and in immune cells by looking at the gene expression and the resulting effect it had on immune cells. So since we know that microgravity causes an immune deficiency and that gene expression in human cells changes when exposed to microgravity because we're all used to being on the ground, microgravity is a great place to gain a better understanding of the role genes or gene expression plays in immune cell function, and it could lead to better treatments for various immune deficiencies, whether caused by a disease or caused by a treatment for a disease. Next slide. This is a great example done by the Michael J. Fox Foundation of actually looking at the target for a drug. So Parkinson's disease is being studied by the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and it's thought that the LRRK2 protein is involved in the progression of Parkinson's disease. And this protein is very difficult to crystallize on the ground, or to get a large crystalline structure so that we can understand its shape. What's interesting about this project is on their first attempt, they didn't grow large enough crystals to resolve the structure better than they can on Earth. But in their second attempt, which flew in November 2018, I understand that they did grow larger and better crystals. And why do we look at those proteins that are considered to be involved in the progression of a disease in space? Well, since crystallization leads to larger crystals with fewer defects, it allows the researcher to see the crystal structure better, which gives us a better understanding of the protein targets for medication, leading to much more effective treatments for various diseases such as Parkinson's and potentially Alzheimer's disease. Next slide, please. The National Cancer Institute here in the US has performed a number of cell culture experiments looking at the creation of microorgans and organoids. As I said before, cells in microgravity tend to form 3D structures without the use of a scaffolding or matrix, and therefore tend to behave more like cells in the human body, the cell-cell signaling being one of the things that's more similar to what happens in our bodies every day. And these model systems can be used for everything from drug efficacy testing, looking at age-related diseases, wound healing, and even looking at the formation of cancer tumors. And what we're trying to do with this is better understand the formation of cancer tumors, leading to better treatments, decreased time to market for medication, and early indications of medication failure. Next slide. Stem cells are another great example of something people really like to study in space. And why is that? It's because stem cells tend to retain their stemness for longer in microgravity. And the value of that is an increased understanding of stem cell functionality to be able to produce new and novel organs, microorgans for transplant. Next slide. Bone regeneration has been studied in space, and again, this relates to stem cells, and that stem cells in microgravity tend to retain their stemness for longer. And this matters because the development of novel methods for tissue engineering and tissue regeneration related to bone loss and other age-related diseases is we can look at that in space and can hopefully in the future help with increased mobility for older people and injured people. And there's definitely increasing evidence, and we know that astronauts tend to lose some of their bone and muscle mass in space, and that also as people age, they tend to have a decrease in bone and muscle mass as well as the number of stem cells in their body. Next slide, please. Another thing that people really like to look at in space are tissue chips, and these can be used to mimic human tissues and cells, everything from the immune system to the lungs, the muscle, and the brain. And again, we look at this in microgravity because the changes in behaviors of cells in microgravity can lead to the studies of human-related diseases in an accelerated manner. And this leads to a better understanding at the molecular basis for a variety of human conditions and diseases, including immune suppression and ways to mitigate diseases, along with improved models for drug efficacy testing. Next slide, please. A way to store medication is lyophilization or freeze drying, and I know Ken will talk about this a bit later, but microgravity, having a near perfect vacuum, is a great place to study the process of freeze drying, and freeze drying can help us improve the shelf life of sensitive medications, as we also talked about with AstraZeneca. Next slide, please. And also looking at what Eli Lilly did, they looked at hard to wet solids. We've all dropped one of those in the glass of water and watched it dissolve. But microgravity allows us to only examine the impact of the surface forces on the dissolution of a tablet in liquid rather than also the gravity forces. And this can help us manufacture tablets which allow for medicine to be absorbed more readily in the body and more efficiently, leading to quicker and healthier recoveries by patients. Next slide. And now for this, I'm going to turn it back over to Cindy.
Yeah, so that was a lot, and that was a lot to digest. I think, and if you go to the next slide, just quickly, Jonathan, there's lots of possible topic areas that related to life science, whether it's drug discovery and all of the areas that Molly just covered with those examples. The next slide, Jonathan. Cell biology with regenerative medicine, stem cell biology and tissue chips, and then the next slide. Ultimately in the 3D printing or microbial study. So the point is there's lots of fodder here. This could be a little bit thick and a lot to go through in one setting. And I think what we'd like to do is turn it back over to Lucy. You know, how do we actually engage going forward in all of these areas that could be so relevant to the work that you do?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Cynthia, Molly, and Jonathan for this presentation. So now that we have said that, it's a lot, as said, it's lots to digest. So how do we engage? Can you please move to the next slide? And I hope this will answer some question also seen in the chat. What we are trying to do is to gather all the European partners in life science that want to do some industrial research in space. And for that, we are going to help you build a kind of portfolio of proposal in order to mutualize all our expertise and funding and to make project flights through our space service provider. So as someone mentioned in the chat, this program has been sponsored by the European Space Agency through the BSGN initiative. So Business in Space Growth Network, and we thank the ESA for that. And so we have a little bit of time. It's the first of the session of webinar that we are doing right now. So it's the beginning, please be kind. But we have approximately 1 year to work with you and to build some successful proposal. If you can go to the next slide, please. So how do we start? What we suggest, and here you have our contact detail, is that first of all, is just reach out and talk to us. If you have an idea, if something was not clear, if you think you have an idea but you're not sure, please do not hesitate to contact us. We are here really to help and to explain in detail what has been a little bit presented today. If you have already an idea, if you have seen in the chat some people that have an idea of experiment, this is great. Just come to us and we can help you to build this proposal. If you are not sure, you think it's interesting, but you don't really know, once again, we are here to redo a specific webinar with you, really dedicated of your particular area, so we can dig in all the scientific publication. Everything is on our website, Connect by CNES. If you go to Connect by CNES, Marie-Pierre, if you can put the link, you go to the healthcare part and you will have something also to reach us. So we have 1 year to work all together and we are here to help. Do not hesitate. I hope it was clear. Next slide, please. Okay, now it's time to talk about space. And with the space provider, we have talked a lot about life science. Let's balance a little bit this presentation.
All right. And so what we've shown on the next slide, Jonathan, is an overview. So say you're you work in the pharmaceutical or biotech arena, and your day job is not to think about doing something in space. You probably have never thought about doing anything in space. Well, that's okay, because there's a whole bunch of organizations that actually have the facilities or the hardware, and they have the processes to translate how you do something on the ground to how it would be done in space. So even though you might want to become a space expert, you don't have to. You can focus on your day job. So Hilda is going to be talking to us in a minute about the work that she's doing with ice cubes and all of the support they have for, as you can see, microorganisms, shelf life, mixing and emulsifying, interfacial studies, all of the stuff that you would actually use to do the work that Molly described earlier. Next slide. Bioreactor Express in Italy, they've got bioreactors and they focus on biotech, food and beverage, and fluids. And again, they've got capability that will support, some of the things that are shown there. Next slide. Lamont, a company based in the US, has a centrifuge and now moving into much more complex work in the cell culture arena. And they focus on, again, crystallization, microorganisms, mixing and emulsifying. Next slide. TechShot, a company in the US with the first 3D bioprinter on station. And it's interesting because they're looking at not just 3D printing of organs, but they're also looking at 3D printing of plant-based and cultured meat products. So that's a really interesting company to think about if you're interested in that area. Next slide. And then Yuri, a company focused in Germany, looking at creating factories in space. And they partner oftentimes with Ice Cubes and Lamont in some of the areas that we've talked about. And I think Hilda can, again, talk about some of these partnerships and how these companies can, again, take what you do on the US or on the terrestrial side and then translate it to how it would be conducted in space. And next slide. And so that takes us to our panel discussion. And we're going to hear a lot more now from Ken Savin and from Hilda Stenuit. And Lucy, I don't know if you want to make some comments introducing the panel, or do we want to just dive in?
So Cynthia, Chloe you have been already introduced. Maybe I can ask Hilde and Ken to start in a few words to just introduce yourself. Sorry, I will start with the lady. Hilde, please.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Cindy. And I'm sorry, Ken. So indeed, my name is Hilde Steenaert. I'm a researcher from background, and I work with a company called Space Application Services, and that is a middle-sized company with headquarters in Belgium, and that also works in the US through a subsidiary in Houston. And I supported, working for Space Application, I supported the European Space Agency for quite some years in a function of mission scientist for the International Space Station. That's also how I got to meet Lucy. And so we did coordination cross-agency of the different research, technology, and educational activities that the different agencies were doing. And now, since a couple of years, I'm supporting our Ice Cube service that can provide you with direct access to these unique assets of space that all of the colleagues kindly introduced. Can I pass it on to you?
Thank you very much, Hilde.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ken Savin, and I formerly worked for Eli Lilly and Company, and I work for the International Space Station U.S. National Lab. I'm a chemist by training, and I'm not from the industry. I was actually just from the pharmaceutical industry, and was approached by someone who worked for the National Lab here in the United States to potentially do work on station, and ultimately led a team, 5 separate teams that ran 5 separate experiments on station, one of which is actually running on station today.
We are very happy to have you. I will let the floor to Cynthia, our moderator, but just for the small, how to say that story, Hilde and myself, if my memory is good, were one of the only few Europeans at the ISS R&D conference. And we were discovering everything. I think, Hilde, you were one of the first one with the commercial services. We have seen Cynthia on stage at the beginning of the conference. So it's funny to be now all on this panel, and we are glad to have you here from the United States. And we hope that we will be able also to have a super great project on our side. So Cynthia, the floor is yours. You have approximately 20 minutes.
Sure. So, Hilda, can you just give us an idea? You know, you talked a little bit about Ice Cubes and the offering, and we just went really quickly through what service providers do to help translate, you know, something here on the ground to what it would be done in space. Can you just talk a little bit more about what that looks like, especially for someone that's never done anything in space? You know, what does that experience feel like for them?
Yes, absolutely. So maybe just to say a couple of extra words on what you guys marvelously introduced, both in terms of why space, but also in terms of already how space and what service providers can do. So on our side, we have a facility on the inside of the International Space Station. So that facility can give you access to these beautiful assets of microgravity, of radiation. And that facility can accommodate a wide range of research and technologies. And we set up that service through a partnership with the European space agencies. And so all of you talked very nicely about how we do space activities, both for the scope of space and space exploration, but for sure also today very explicitly on how we use space for Earth. And that's definitely also what we address through the IceCube service, by bringing these customizable units, or cubes as we refer to them, although they don't need to be cubic necessarily, to space that can carry your research in these customizable units. So suppose you, as Cindy asked, have an idea, but you have no idea. Well, obviously, you can already talk to Lucie and Marie-Laure. That's already an excellent first step. But we're also happy to talk to you and to understand what would be your idea, what would be your experiment, what would be your research goals. We do that through a call, through email. We also work with a kind of questionnaire that allows you to give your high-level thoughts and some information that you already know. And we're quite open for everything from pretty wild ideas to also things that are almost ready to fly. And then we will, from our side, from the service provider side, together in this case with Lucie and her colleagues, we can look at, okay, what does it take to bring your research to space? How feasible is it? How can we tune maybe your goals in the direction of what could be the most suitable setup in space? What does it require to bring it to space, to make it function in space? So you have your way that you do your research in your lab on Earth, but how to translate that to space, how maybe to miniaturize it, how maybe to automate it. Obviously, you understand that bringing things to space requires that it's low in volume, low in mass. So that's maybe something to look at. We will also talk with you about your idea of possible launch times and programmatic aspects. Again, also I refer to Lucie and her colleagues in maybe in terms of funding possibilities. And so we will iterate with you on that setup to make sure that it's a feasible setup, but that it's most promising research results for what you want to do. And so there's multiple possibilities. Either there will be a setup or hardware that has maybe flown in the past. Then you can use that. Then it's relatively short for you to define, for example, what samples you want to fly. And that can really be done months before a certain launch date. Or it turns out that your research needs a specific development or a specific new setup to be designed and developed. Then you can either choose to develop that yourself, or you can look for assistance in the design and the development. That's also something that we can help with from our side if that's helpful, or we can point in the direction of other experts in your area to help you with the development. And then throughout the further processes, we basically take care of all the space processes. We don't think you should necessarily want to learn about all the how to deal with all of the safety process, for example, or all of the agency contact. So that's typically what we take care of. We want you to be able to concentrate on your research and start counting down to your launch.
That's great. And speaking of beginnings, and Lucie's point of how all of our lives intersected at different points, Ken Savin, when that person called Cynthia called you way back in Indianapolis and said, let's do something in space, why don't you talk about some of the things that you were doing, Ken was actually, you know, not just a chemist or a director at Eli Lilly. You really were running these innovation days within the Eli Lilly company. And, you know, describe some of the things that happened as a result of incorporating this new way of thinking, you know, space, which you guys would have never thought about, into your innovation processes, and, you know, with the result being 4 projects that went to the International Space Station.
Yeah, so Cindy Buteau was the one who actually called me. Yep, and we really had no plans to do anything in space. In fact, when Cynthia called, I thought somebody was just playing a trick on me. But we did. I was running a series of innovation programs within the organization in our discovery and development units, and in marketing and other parts of the organization. And we started to look at this as an opportunity to do more innovative work, to get employees to think differently about the work they were doing. What we didn't expect was that people would actually become engaged in other ways. There were people who were scientists and they were developing science to be run on station. And we had a specific criteria around that. Had to be safe, had to be, space needed to be necessary for doing the science. It had to have impact on our own portfolio. We weren't going to do things that were just fun to do. And we set up a program to do evaluations for those, and had people from the National Lab come out as part of a panel to evaluate that science. And that was exciting and kind of what I think the traditional aspect of what we would have expected. But what also came of it was engagement by our employees in the program from the standpoint of science, from the standpoint of media and external and internal communications. It became a very big deal for our organization. In fact, within 30 minutes of the launch of the first science experiment, there was a picture of the team, our team down in Florida at the launch site, on our corporate website, on our recruiting website, where we try to attract new employees, because there was a really big push to get young, different thinking scientists to join the company. And this is how you do it. You do it by getting them engaged in doing something that is special and perhaps not traditional. We had mission patches developed. Our CEO and our top leadership, are now the person who's our chief scientific officer. These were all people who are engaged in not only helping to design the science and think about the impact on a technical side for our organization, but also on how it was an expression of us as an organization. So the impact was varied and multidimensional, and is to this day still a significant aspect of the way we think about doing science.
And I would just add, Ken was based in Indianapolis, which is in Indiana here in the United States. And speaking of the flight patch, Ken had his team, once they decided on what the projects they were doing, he rented a large van type truck, drove from Indianapolis with his team to Glenn Research Center in Ohio. They hop out of their truck, we all go into Glenn Research Center to sit around the table to discuss the science. But while they were there, they were looking at the walls of Glenn Research Center and saw all the mission patches. And that's when all of these scientists started doodling flight patch designs that then Ken, as he just said, had his CEO of Eli Lilly and Company actually announce a flight patch competition. So I think it was such an amazing thing to watch, Ken, to see how you really incorporated innovation and new ways of thinking by using these programs. So that's great. But let me ask you this, and then I'm going to ask Hilda the same thing. You know, there's so many positives about doing things in space. What are some of the things, the challenges and that you faced and that you overcame? And what are some of the benefits that you got that were not expected as part of this whole process?
So a couple of the challenges that, again, I was naive to the whole process. So it was all new. But there were two things that kind of stand out for me. So the first was I'm used to having a lab that I can drive to, and in a short period of time. In fact, I actually have a lab in my garage, so I can just walk into my garage and do science if I want in there. But this is a totally different experience. This is a lab that is very far away and that I will personally never visit. So my science has to be translated to someone who may not be a scientist to execute for me. And I have to think about all the other pieces that may be, analytical support or technique that are to me second nature, and to the people who will be doing the science, who I may never meet personally, having to explain it so they can execute it in the right way. So that was something that for me had to really made me reflect on my own science, but also on how I describe it and how things get done. With that, you also have to consider that it takes a lot longer than you think it's going to, right? The science, again, I can walk into my garage and go run a reaction and I'm done. I'm done that day. Whereas this, you have to be part of a schedule. The schedules, there's a lot of people ahead of you in the schedule to get things done in space. You have to get manifested to a rocket. You have to go through all the safety and training that someone is going to need to run your experiment. So those two parts were unexpected for me, maybe should have been expected. And there are good sides to it, but still they were, I feel, difficulties that needed to be overcome. On the benefit side, though, the benefits are that you get a chance to reflect on your science in a way that you would not otherwise. That was for us the biggest piece. Conversations that we had amongst ourselves at Eli Lilly that we had not thought about since we were kids in school, and the way we think about doing science and some of the basic foundational aspects of science that impact our work. I think that was, for me, one of the most impactful parts. The other was that it got others in the organization excited about science, where they were just going to work and they were in marketing, and that's what they did. They were marketers. But all of a sudden, those people started asking questions about the science, about what we did and why we were doing things in space. And there were even people who had nothing to do with the science, whose kids went to school with my kids, who would tell their children that, yes, they were part of that experiment. They were part of that science, even though it had nothing to do with it, because they wanted to be a part of it. And you're doing something right when someone is lying about being on your team. Okay? That's when you've been successful.
All right. Well, Ken, thank you. And I think, Hilda, if we're thinking about, some of the things or the challenges that Ken just described, you're coming at this and you're not part of the space community. I think you did a great job at the beginning, Hilda, explaining all of that translation that you do. Could you give us some examples of some of the flight projects that you've done, and especially those that are now really focused on increasing your access, increasing your time to flight, making things as easy and, as iterative as possible for that end user?
Yes, absolutely. I think the fact that Ken mentioned this time schedule is excellent to highlight, because we come from the space side. And then when you compare with projects that are run through the agencies that typically take maybe 5 to 10 years to get on board, now with the access through commercial space, that has changed significantly. So although that is still quite long compared to the Earth Lab that Ken is talking about, for us, this has made a huge difference. And indeed, we run a number of projects now that actually work very quickly. I think Molly and also Jonathan referred to crystallization, for example, of proteins or large molecules. And you referred to the examples of Merck with their Keytruda, or the Parkinson's disease, Michael J. Fox Foundation example. So we run actually together with a Japanese partner, a crystallization service, and they have designed a little, really 10 by 10 by 10 centimeters type of incubator that allows to put these proteins at the right temperature to have them crystallized in space. That is something that we fly very regularly. So if you are interested in such a type of project, that allows you to get on board really in a matter of months. And so I think that's really important, that it really depends if we're talking about a new type of setup, and that's what Ken was also referring to, that needs to be developed and needs to go through all of these verification, testing, safety, or if we can use some of the items that have been flown before. In August, we're flying another project in the genomics area related to human skin microbiome samples from type 2 diabetic patients that will be analyzed through multi-omics. And so that also uses a setup that we have already developed. So it allows really for these scientists to get on board very quickly with their samples. Also, there's multiple hardwares that Cindy also referred to from some of the other service providers, like TechShots. We also have our BioCube that allows for cell culture. So all of that can go relatively quickly. And that, I think, is one good thing on the timeline aspect. One other hurdle that I wanted to mention on your question is, in general, the awareness. And I think it's excellent that MEDES and Connect by CNES are starting with these webinars, because one of the main hurdles we realize is awareness. We are from two different worlds in a way, from the life sciences, from space. And sometimes we realize we may talk a bit of different language. We need to learn speaking each other language. We need to overcome silos, and we need to put, and that's at the same time my answer to your benefit. So we can here, through utilizing space for these Earth R&D, we can come to completely novel solutions that are very innovative. And so we are looking for synergies between these two super exciting innovation areas of, on the one hand, the life sciences, on the other hand, the space. And so that narrative of utilizing space and building it into Earth value chain, that for me is a huge benefit that we can address here by increasing the awareness and finding synergies and collaborations.
All right, thank you, Hilda. And I'm thinking, based on what Ken and Hilda, what you both have talked about, I think you're probably provoking a lot of questions from our audience. So what I think we'd like to do is open up questions now, not just for Ken and Hilda, but for Lucy or Chloe or Jonathan, Molly, myself, so that we get at least 15 minutes of Q&A in. And Ken and Hilda, if you've got anything, that you wanted to sort of convey in this talk, in this panel, perhaps you could get those out through the Q&A session now. So, Lucy, do you want to take some of the questions that have come through already? And then I'll ask the audience, did Hilda and Ken say anything that are provoking questions? And if so, do you want to write them in the chat, and we'll make sure we cover those as well. But over to you, Lucy. For that.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I've seen already quite a few questions in the chat. I'm going to try to start from the beginning. There is several questions about people that are a little bit aware of what's happening on ESA side. And they mentioned this ESA Business in Space Growth Network. So in a nutshell, let me summarize what it is. So we mentioned it a little bit in the webinar. It's ESA, that is our European Space Agency, that would like to support European companies to propose some project and have access to the space services. And for that, they ask several people in Europe to try to come up and to partner with people from vertical market area to propose some program to help people like you that have never heard about space to implement some experiment. And this is why we are working with Chloe's team, and we thank again Science Biotech. I will have a question for you afterwards, Chloe. And so yes, this webinar, it's part of the BSGN project. And how does that work? So in terms of funding, I will answer one of the questions that is about funding. Yes, going to space is not free. It costs something for the company, but you have a very broad range of price depending on the complexity of your experiment. As Hilde mentioned, we have already some what we call payload or some instruments that are dedicated to your purpose. So of course it reduces the cost, and we are here to help you optimize the project, but also the financial envelope that is needed. And ESA, in order to support European project, offer to cover like approximately 50% of the cost of the total envelope. So it doesn't mean that you personally, especially if you are a startup, have to bring the missing 50%. It means that we all together, with the projects that we are going to select, we are going to look for different ways to fund this additional money in order that you're able to do your experiment in a good condition. So this is really how it works. So if money is a problem, I'm going to be very straightforward. Please come to us, we work together, we discuss, we try some partnership. And the idea, this is why we are all together today. It's a group effort. So that's, I hope it answers some of the questions that I've seen. And then I've seen another question from Sylvie. Sylvie asked, not really sure about the purpose of the program. Is it to innovate for your internal program or to propose program to CNES? So this is two different things. Of course, proposing program to CNES or to other agencies for exploration purposes, this is something that is doable. It's just not our team that is handling it. So if you want to propose an innovation for space exploration to the agency, please contact our colleague on the CNES website and you will have the contact. There is some ITT every year for this purpose. What we are doing here is the other way around. If you remember the schematic, is really for, as Ken described, for your innovation program internally. If space or doing R&D in space can help, now we are here to help and to really help you redirect the benefit, such as IP, pattern, innovation, motivation of the group, hiring of new people, and of course, new market share, new market access, but for your benefit. So I hope it clarifies the two initiatives. They work together. It's just a different team. And I don't know if there is further question. If not, can I ask my question to Chloé in the meantime?
Yes.
Chloé, alors, another story of how we met. I was invited by France Biotech to give a keynote about space in order to, I don't know, give a little bit of a dream for the members. And then when I approached you, Chloé, with this new initiative, what were your first thoughts?
I found it really exciting. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting project. In my mind, like all the scientific research which was done on the ISS kind of belongs to either, you know, the NASA or CNES or the ESA. So I didn't know that there was this possibility for companies to actually do their own R&D. I was extremely surprised, extremely excited, extremely curious. It's true that I think for, you know, entrepreneurs, even in the life sciences area, this is all very new. I think the audience is discovering a lot of information, and it's really fascinating to think that there have been, you know, successful projects implemented. So yeah, I think it's very exciting and quite incredible when you think about it. That, you know, your protein can go up to space, 400 kilometers above your head, and you know, being able to have some very interesting experimental conditions which you described early on, it's very, very exciting. So yeah, it's a very exciting project. And I think it's nice to have some like examples like you talked about earlier, and to see that projects have been implemented and that this, you know, this is happening. This is yeah. So yeah, great project. I'm very excited.
Okay. Not too
Lucy?
crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add something to the question around whether it is for CNES or for the organization. And I would argue that if you're coming from a private industrial group, some organization, some company, and you are not doing this for your own company, if it is not important to your own company, then you should not do it, because it is hard enough that, and it is going to be expensive, right? I don't care where you think you're going to get all your money. That company is going to be investing, if minimally, it's people's time and effort, and there's cost associated with that. If it's not important to you, then you shouldn't do it. It's just too hard. You want to do something that is really valuable to your own organization and that you can see a benefit on the backside from doing that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's really important.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that gets back to Ken. You made the point of the criteria, you know, and on the why going to the International Space Station, the criteria has to be, it is a unique use of space, like the microgravity or the extreme conditions or the vantage point. Because if you can do it in the lab down the hall, you should do it in the lab down the hall. I mean, there's got to be that unique reason. And then, you know, to what Ken just said, that's a lot of how we work with organizations. You know, we help prioritize your goals, your research portfolio, your company mission and objectives with, you know, what are the results you're going to get in space? And to what Ken said, that's always been the way those projects are prioritized. It's those that have the biggest impact to what those goals are for the organization. So Lucy and Ken and Chloe, I think those are all excellent points there.
May I ask an additional question to Ken if there is no further question in the chat? I don't think there is. Ken, question to you. When you were at Eli Lilly and you had to pitch to your management that you were going something to space, I understand that for a pharmaceutical company or any kind of company, there is lots of competition already on Earth in terms of innovation, in terms of market share. Some of these companies are public. How do you had the insight of the activity? You were new to space to be able to defend it enough so that it has a small place within your planned innovation?
So I had to go to my direct manager and explain what I was doing, and they saw it as an opportunity to innovate, as I had mentioned. But they also said something to me very interesting. They said, I want something that my employees want to come into work to be a part of, right? And that was something that they saw and ended up being, you know, people got very excited. We didn't have any trouble with that. People really wanted to come in and see it. The trouble I had, though, or that I perceived I would have, is when I would go to the upper management, the executives. And at the time, our chief executive officer, who was a chemist originally when he joined the company years before, he things that we did in the news because it was never good. That was his argument. So I knew I had to send a note to him, and I ended up putting together a very simple email just saying, John, this is what we're going to do. We're going to work with some people from CASIS and NASA to run some experiments in space. We've got projects picked out that are important to the company, and we've got teams of people. And I ended it with, I don't think it's going to be a really big deal. Worry about it. I was trying to downplay it. And within like 30 seconds, I get an email back from John saying, what do you mean? Not a big deal. This is a huge deal. We're going to have parties when we launch our experiments and serve punch and cookies. And he really got into it. And he said, oh, and by the way, you've got a new sponsor. And I wrote back as like, who? And he said, well, I'm your sponsor. I'm going to sponsor this program, all these projects. So I think that's also a critical piece, is you need to have the support of your management, and you have to have the bigger plan. Now, we put together the plan. We sort of crafted it over time as the projects and the whole program developed. But if I knew now knew then what I know now, I would have done things differently. And we try to teach that to people, to have a communication plan ahead of time for external purposes, but also internally to your own organization, to explain to people what's going on. And you want to play up the media side of this. This is something that I was also naive to, is the whole impact of that. But your organization, or at least in the pharmaceutical industry in the United States, we're always looking for positive things to talk about, to be able to go tell people this is what we're doing. And in this case, we're able to describe it and say, not only were we doing this great stuff in space, but we were doing things that would ultimately impact them as patients, physicians, insurers, the whole value chain would be impacted by the work that we were doing. And some of the experiments, although Molly described a few of them with our experiments looking at how things dissolve, hard to wet solids, and lyophilization, freeze drying in space. There was one experiment where the people had actually been trying to find a way to get it run in space and did not know who to call. And that was a very significant step in that whole project's development. An advanced project, they needed to run it in space. There was good reason to do it. And ultimately that played into their science, but also the way they described their product.
Incredible. All right, well, I think we have 2 minutes left. I am not seeing any new questions pop up. And to what Lucy said before, I just want to make sure we have hit all of the prior questions. If not, please just add another a chat
There
item.
is a question from Emmanuel. Hi, Emmanuel. So Emmanuel is asking for the next step milestone. For the timeline slide, you mentioned that you have 1 year, but it will start in April 2022. You're correct. We have 1 year until April 2022 to gather all the motivated people and proposals and to make them almost ready for a successful space project. And in April 2022, we are going to review all our proposal, and we are going to ask you, and we gather a committee of experts and mentors, but also ESA, and say, okay, this one are going to be implemented as the first cohort of this program in space. So we do have 1 year, a kind of informal work all together, but in April 2022, things get real, and we hope that we will fly quite soon. As Hilde mentioned, now there is very quick possibility to be in space. So yeah, 1 year starting now to convince ESA.
All right, and we just got another question on, can you remind us of the next webinars, please? So Jonathan, do you have those dates?
Sure. The webinar on agronutrition will be July 8th. The webinar on cosmetics and consumer products will be July 13th. Both of those will be starting at the same time. So it'll be 3 p.m., 1500 hours Paris time. And then there'll be a biomanufacturing webinar with a date to be determined, hopefully later on in the month of July. Again, probably the same time start, 1500 local time.
All right, and over to you, Lucy, to wrap it up. I think we have 30 seconds.
Yes, I have a few seconds to say thank you very much. Thank you for all the speakers, the panelists. It has been a lot today. I think it's super interesting. It's the first of our series of 4 webinars. So sorry, it was a trial, but I think it's great. I could also ask all my questions to the expert, which is great. Thank you especially for Space Commerce Matters that has organize everything, help us find the speaker. Thank you for Couleur Citron and all the team, especially Pierre. Pierre, this is a special thanks for you because we have been harassing you with all the technicality just before the panel. So yeah, I hope it was interesting. Do not hesitate to send us an email, even if it's just for a question. And I hope to see you in the next webinars. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.